A Cornish Maid. Side 3. They were due to hold a play rehearsal on the day he left for France. Another boy acted as Luke's understudy and was to take his place, but the time went on and Mr. Thomas failed to turn up after normal lessons. He usually went back to his house for a change of clothes and then returned to the school. After half an hour's fidgeting and catcalling among the would-be actors, a quivering Miss Dean came into the classroom and called them to order.
"I'm afraid I've got some very upsetting news to tell you. Mr. Thomas won't be coming to rehearsals today, and it may be that we abandon his play altogether."
In the uproar following her words, she shouted at them to be quiet in a voice quite unlike her usual mild-mannered way.
"Mr. Thomas has had a telegram to say that his son has been killed in France. It's a terrible thing to happen at any time, but even more so when he might have been one of the soldiers coming home to Falmouth from Dunkirk."
She choked on the last words and swallowed hard amid the shocked murmurs among the pupils, and then went on as best she could. "I want you all to go home as quietly as possible now as a mark of respect. I'm sure none of us feels like continuing today." They grabbed their school bags and the obnoxious gas masks, which half of the country had abandoned carrying now, and filed out. Some of the girls were crying, others simply couldn't look at one another. It was hard for them to come to terms with the fact that the pompous little man they had so often laughed at behind his back was now a grieving father whose son had been killed somewhere in France. Every one of them was unnerved by the news so close to home, and Luke Gillam, one of their schoolmates, was on his way to France right now.
"I hate this war,"
Amber ground out on the way back to the cottage.
"I bleeding well hate it more,"
Dolly said.
"My dad's in France too." "Oh, Dolly, are you sure?"
Amber said. She shrugged.
"Well, that's what my mum said, but you never know whether to believe her or not." "You can't say things like that about your mother." "Why not? She'll say anything if it'll get her what she wants. She wanted me out of the way soon enough when it suited her, and I bet she'll send for me to go back to London when it suits her too."
Amber didn't know what to say to this bit of news about Dolly's mother. She'd overheard Granny Penn and Mrs. Phillips next door refer to Gertie Nash as a flighty piece of goods, but she had been brought up in a God-fearing household, and she found it hard to imagine a grown-up telling lies to suit herself. Dolly wasn't above being a bit devious to get her own way, but Amber thought she fell short of telling outright whoppers.
"Anyway, that's what you want, isn't it?"
Amber said encouragingly.
"To go back to London, I mean."
Dolly leant over the handlebars of her bike as they neared the cottage.
"Well, I did," she said savagely. "I'm not so sure now. I never thought I'd say it, but it's not so bad down here, especially if Jerry's going to start bombing. I'd rather be safe than bleeding well dead."
"I'd rather you was safe as well," Amber said reluctantly. She wouldn't go so far as to say they were friends, because they weren't. Not really. Not close. And yet they could hardly be otherwise, sharing their lives as much as they did. She took a deep breath after that momentous thought.
"You're not too bad, Dolly. I suppose I could have had somebody far worse than you being dumped on Gran and me."
Dolly grinned.
"Well, we ain't exactly Siamese twins, but I suppose I could have been dumped on somebody worse as well."
They pedalled on towards the cottage, too embarrassed to say anything more. But it was weird how something as tragic as hearing about old Tomo's son, who had been killed in France, and the fact of all those ships, big and small, heroically setting off for France right now to rescue their poor stranded soldiers, seemed to mark a shift in the relationship between two very different and unimportant schoolgirls. People thronged the quays and waterfront between the end of May and beginning of June, watching and waiting for the ships to return with their human cargo. The larger ships found a haven in the deep water harbour and spilled out hundreds of soldiers, many of whom were wounded, some on stretchers, others on crutches, and all of them exhausted after the struggle to survive and grateful to their saviours. The women of the town were on hand with tea and welcome cigarettes, along with the Red Cross and ambulance services, all ready to help out wherever they were needed. The Forces Club, near the harbour, was turned into a temporary staging post until the men could be sent back on trains and buses to their homes or to hospital. The entire harbour throbbed with activity on shore and off, and there were boats as far as the eye could see, almost stretching to the horizon, Amber told Dolly excitedly, completely caught up in the thrill of it all now.
They say some of the little boats have gone back and forth across the channel several times, she reported. I hope Luke has got home all right.
They looked at one another. For once Amber didn't feel jealous of Dolly's blonde hair and china blue eyes, so much lighter than her own. For once they only had one thought in mind, that Luke Gillam, in his father's motorboat, would return to Falmouth safely.
I'm going to the boatyard to ask his mother, Amber said, scrambling off the seat by the jetty where they had been watching all the activity. I'm coming as well, Dolly said, before Amber could protest. What mattered most was knowing that Luke and his father were home. Not yet, his mother said when they turned up, out of breath and asking the all-important question. But I'm not too worried. They're good seamen, both of them, and they've got a good craft beneath them. She spoke with all the authority of a seafarer's wife as she smiled at the two young girls, their hair wild and unkempt, chests heaving with the effort of rivalling one another to get there first, and she had a sudden flash of foresight as to which of them might steal her son's heart. She dismissed it at once. They were children, concerned about a school pal, that was all. But their anxiety was no less real, and to calm them down she gave them lemonade and cake, and showed them photos of Luke as a baby and a small boy, which made them laugh. Some time later they heard shouting, and then Luke and his father came into the house. They looked tired and strained, and as unkempt as the girls, and Luke's face and clothes were covered in blood. Dolly screamed, and Amber snapped at her not to show herself up. I'm all right, Luke said harshly. We had as many men as we could cram in the boat, and one of them was badly injured. It's his blood, not mine. We got him off the boat and into an ambulance, but I don't give much for his chances. I'm going to get cleaned up, and after a bite to eat, me and Dad are going back again. Please, don't go back again. It's too dangerous, Dolly begged, blanched by the sight of his blood-stained clothes and skin. Don't be stupid, Dolly, Amber said, wanting to shake her. They can't leave our soldiers over there to get slaughtered, can they? Your dad might be one of them, remember? Dolly burst into tears, to be comforted by Luke's mother, while Luke and his father cleared their throats and went upstairs to wash and change their clothes. And Amber thought furiously that if this wasn't just like Dolly Daydream, taking every advantage of the situation to be all soft and fluffy and tearful, while Amber had appeared to be hard and unfeeling, which she bloody well wasn't, she thought, allowing the swear word to creep into her mind. She was as terrified for Luke as anybody. More so, in fact, as she had every right to be. She was the one who loved him, wasn't she? You two girls get along home now, Mrs. Gillam said gently, once she had extricated herself from Dolly's clinging arms. You've seen that Luke's all right, and I'm sure the worst of the evacuation must be over by now. One more trip will probably be their last, she added, mentally crossing her fingers as she spoke. They had no option but to do as they were told. They went back through the town, dodging the crush of people and helpers, and the convoys of vehicles now filling every street that were taking the soldiers to their various destinations. As if by instinct, they didn't go back to the cottage yet. Instead, they pedalled their bikes furiously to Pendennis Castle headland, where they could look down at the chaotic scenes below. The harbour was still bursting with the number of boats, the quays swarming with people, and the faint, sickly, sweet smell of blood was on the air.
In these last few days, the realization of what war could do to people had become frighteningly real to them both. Granny Penn had told them not to go near the quays, but in the first excitement of wanting to see what was happening, some of the sights had filled them with horror. Amber's vague ambitions of being a nurse were being severely questioned now, after seeing some of the men with raw and bleeding injuries, barely covered by ragged and dirty bandages.
Sometimes I don't think there's any point in being good if you're just going to end up crippled or killed, she said in a sudden rage. Blimey, that's a turn-up. What's got into you? Dolly said. I'm thinking about all the young chaps around here who joined up as soon as the war broke out, and already some of them aren't coming back. Old Tomo's son, for one. What's the point of being a hero? Like Luke, you mean?
Amber snorted. That wasn't what she meant at all. She was still thanking God that Luke wasn't old enough to be a proper soldier, or sailor, or whatever he wanted to be.
Leave Luke out of it, she said rudely. He's different.
And he's mine, she thought passionately. Mr. Thomas didn't return to the school after his son's death. He was already on the brink of retiring, and the play was abandoned. The pupils had little heart to continue with the drama group without his encouragement, and, as none of the other teachers had Tomo's expertise to direct them, it simply disintegrated. They all seemed to have grown up considerably since that awful day when the war had come right into their classroom, and since it was near the end of term, many of them lacked interest in lessons too. It was a situation that couldn't continue, and they were called to account by the headmaster and told that life had to go on no matter what tragedies befell them.
It's all right for him to say that, Amber Penry snapped to anyone who would listen. It's not his son who was killed, is it?
She was restless and frustrated in a way she didn't fully understand. She and Dolly had become closer in a strange way, as if their lives were interlocked regardless of anything they could do about it. They were even being called the Wild Penry Girls now, a term that didn't entirely displease Dolly, even though she didn't strictly qualify for the name. They had discovered that singly they irritated one another in their different ways, but together they were a strong unit. And this sense of unity had developed into being disruptive and awkward at school, and a trial to Granny Penn at home.
I'm not sure I want them around all day in the school holidays, Granny Penn told her group of card players one Wednesday afternoon. I don't know what's got into them lately. Amber was always strong-willed, of course, but Dolly was such a sweet little thing. No, they're like a pair of whirling dervishes, flying about here, there, and everywhere, and leaving their bedroom in a constant muddle. They're growing up, that's what, Win Phillips said sagely. You should know what it's like at their age, if you can remember that far back. I'm not so old that I don't remember what it's like to be young, thank you, missus, she replied smartly. But I don't recall being quite as contrary as those two. Half the time they're as thick as thieves, and the rest of it they're squabbling over something petty. Maybe they're fighting over some boy, one of the others said. If they're mooning about the place, it's a sure sign of trouble brewing in that direction. I'm surprised you haven't checked it in their tea leaves, Granny Penn. Well, I haven't. They're always racing about on their bikes with that school crowd of theirs, but I don't know as there's one of them singled out now that nice Luke Gillam has gone out of favour since he started work with his father. So, let's forget them for the time being and get on with more important business, she said, shuffling the pack of cards determinedly. If the girls had had to grow up suddenly after recent events, so had Luke Gillam, and far more soberly than they were aware. In the several hazardous trips he and his father had made to Dunkirk, he had seen sights he never wanted to see again, but which he simply couldn't get out of his head. Men with their heads half bashed in, with gaping wounds that were never going to heal. And men only a few years older than himself, blinded, or with half their limbs torn away. They were images forever fixed in his consciousness. The man's blood that had covered him in the boat had spurted out from a bubbling artery, and the shock of it had nearly finished him as well as the soldier concerned. It had changed him. He wasn't the same young boy who had gone out so eagerly that night, but one thing was clearer than ever in his mind. The minute he was old enough, he was going to join up. Now that he had left school behind him, that was the only thought in his mind. He wanted to go and fight, like every other red-blooded chap in the country. There was no time for girls. He knew there were couples in the town who had married hastily before the men joined up, but young as he was, he thought it was folly to tie yourself up without ever knowing if you would come home again. There would be time enough for that when the war was over, and without realizing the insensitivity of his actions, he virtually turned his back on his old gang of friends, who were still such school kids, and concentrated on becoming a craftsman until his time came.
You might as well face it, Amber. Luke Gillam don't want to be bothered with you no more. It always happens when they leave school and think themselves better than the rest of us.
Dolly taunted her, after finding Luke's name written a dozen times on the inside cover of Amber's school rough book.
Give me that,
Amber said, snatching it from her. You don't know what you're talking about.
I know you've always been sweet on him. If I have, it's none of your business. Give me my book anyway.
They had been given a project about America to do in the school holidays, and tomorrow would be July the 4th, American Independence Day. The midsummer day was hot, and they had brought their books up to the headland instead of working indoors. By now, after the efforts of the little ships to bring the troops out of Dunkirk, it was clear that the Germans had control of the French coast, and everyone feared that they would be next. When the horrific news broke that the Channel Islands had been occupied by the Germans, every precaution was taken to protect the coast and the cities on the mainland. In Falmouth, and all along the Cornish coast now, the beaches bristled with barbed wire, and barrage balloons floated high above the docks like prehistoric monsters. It still seemed unreal to think that the Germans would invade England, but a month ago Mr. Churchill had told the nation that they would fight them on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, and in the hills. So since the new Prime Minister had said it, they had to believe it, Granny Penn had told the two girls in her care.
I'm tired of doing this project, Amber said, her nerves increasingly jangled by the sight of all the preparations for invasion. I'm going home.
She didn't have the kind of premonitions Granny Penn was reputed to have, although lately her gran hadn't said much that anybody couldn't see by reading the newspapers, and it didn't need her tea leaves to know what was coming. But that day it was as if Amber was holding her breath, waiting for she didn't know what. Dolly couldn't see anything amiss, but then Dolly couldn't see beyond the blue sky and grumbling about how the huge barrage balloons blotted out the sun. The next day, American Independence Day, Falmouth docks had its first taste of German bombs after the sickening sound of the air raid sirens split the silence of the night. As soon as they heard the dismal whining sound, the girls were bundled into a cupboard under the stairs to try to sleep, while Granny Penn sat beneath the solid kitchen table with her knitting, refusing to go to bed until the all clear sounded. She had stubbornly resisted having a shelter put up in the garden, which was so small it would have taken all the light from the cottage windows.
They're building dummy railway stations to fool the Germans,
Granny Penn told them later, with her uncanny way of finding out local news almost before it happened.
The lights will be turned on in the dummy areas to divert the bombs away from the docks and the town.
Dolly didn't see the sense of it, but she had another thought on her mind now.
If the Jerrys are dropping bombs here, I might as well go home. I'm writing to my mum to ask her to come and get me, she announced.
I don't think that's very wise, Dolly.
Well, you can't stop me. It's up to my mum where I stay, not you.
She wrote the letter that night, and Amber was in two minds whether or not she wanted Dolly to leave. Surprisingly, she knew she would miss her. But before there was any chance for Gertie Nash to make one of her infrequent replies, central London was attacked by German bombers in August, and from September onwards came an onslaught of air raids on the capital, which stopped any more idea of Dolly going home.
It looks as if I'm stuck here for a bit longer,
Dolly said sulkily, as another Christmas and February birthday came and went, and the news from London became increasingly terrifying. The relentless bombing raids were now being called the Blitz, and among Dolly's mum's erratic letters came one telling Dolly that even Buckingham Palace had been bombed, which everybody knew anyway, since it had been reported with many pictures of bombed-out streets and buildings in London, and photographs of the King and Queen walking amongst the rubble. And Queen Elizabeth had made the remark that now that Buckingham Palace had been bombed as well, they could look the East End in the face, which cheered everybody up according to Gertie. After this important bit of information, although Dolly was never quite sure whether her mother was being sarcastic or not, Gertie also told her daughter not to worry because their own place hadn't been bombed out yet, and somebody, called Uncle Joe, was seeing that she was all right with extra rations.
"He sounds like a good friend,"
Amber said cautiously, although at 14 now, she had more than a shrewd idea of how Dolly's mum was paying for her extra rations.
"Friend, my Aunt Fanny," Dolly said with a sniff. "More like a fancy man, if you ask me." "Oh, don't look so shocked, Amber. I can guess what's been going on, even if I didn't twig it when I was younger."
"Well, at least she's getting plenty to eat," Amber said, not knowing what else to say.
"And plenty of something else too," Dolly snapped. "I ain't no bleeding saint, but it's not fair that my dad's away fighting while this spiv has his fun with my mum. And in our house too."
They all knew what a spiv was by now. A spiv could somehow lay his hands on anything, from extra food rations to petrol coupons, or anything else that could be obtained not quite legally.
"Mind you,"
Dolly went on thoughtfully, her mood abruptly changing,
"I often wonder what it's like, doing that stuff. You know. Mum always seemed to be giggling, so it can't be too horrible, can it?"
Amber was quick to catch on. They'd had a brief and sketchy lesson about reproduction at school, mainly to do with rabbits, which told them precisely nothing that they really wanted to hear. Or maybe it might have done if the boys in the class hadn't been grinning like idiots as the teacher got redder and redder.
"It's for married people, isn't it?" Amber said. "Me and Gran went to a wedding once, and the vicar was going on about marriage being for mutual comfort and the procreation of children. I asked Gran what it meant, and she said I'd know when I was older. And I still don't, not really." "We could ask her," Dolly said. "You could, anyway. She's your Gran." "She's always my Gran when something awkward crops up, isn't she?" "Well, she is. So will you?" "No," Amber said crossly. Somehow she couldn't imagine her Gran going into such details. In any case, she had already asked Luke. At one time she could have asked him anything, even something as personal as this, but she hardly ever saw him now, and the love in her heart remained an unfulfilled and beautiful dream, she thought dramatically. "But it must be weird, doing it with one person, and then another one," Dolly persisted now, forgetting it was her mum they had been discussing, her eyes full of curiosity and something that was bordering on excitement. "Good Lord, Dolly Nash, there's nothing glamorous about it," Amber said. "If you're married, it's being unfaithful." Dolly went bright red. "Are you calling my mother unfaithful?" "Well, isn't she? You said the uncles kept coming to the house when your dad was on night shift. And now your dad's away in the army, there's this Uncle Joe, who you've never heard about before." "Sometimes I hate you. You're always so perishing clever," Dolly yelled. "Just because my mum's friendly to people don't mean she deserves a bad name."
She looked so comical standing there with her hands on her hips and glaring so hard she almost had sparks coming out of her eyes that Amber had to laugh.
You know I'm right, and anyway, it's probably quite flattering to have people thinking she's nice and friendly when your dad's away, she said as delicately as she could. You seemed to think it was exciting a minute ago. You like it when your mum sends you things, and I bet she gets half of it from Uncle Joe.
Dolly had been receiving the odd parcel lately. A new blouse, with no questions asked regarding clothing coupons, a few packets of hair shampoo, a nice brush and comb set, and even a pale pink lipstick, since Dolly was growing up now, her mum's letter said, which had caused a huge argument with Granny Penn, and she had been forbidden to use it outside the house, which only made Dolly slip it into her pocket for her and Amber to apply it as soon as they were out of sight. Amber had her own thoughts about when the war was over and Dolly's dad would be coming home. Presumably, Uncle Joe and all the others would disappear again then, unless her dad went back to his old night shift job. When the war was over was a phrase that was often on people's lips, but as the Blitz in London continued and air raids all along the coast and on the big cities became part of daily life, the end of it seemed as far away as ever. As the danger increased, the children who had gone back to their homes in London during the phony war came flooding back to all parts of the country in a new wave of evacuees. Almost to her surprise, Dolly was quite glad now that her mother hadn't given in to her pleas to go home. She was used to it down here in the sticks. She was used to Granny Penn and her funny little ways, even her dire predictions about how it all had to get worse before it got better, and her card-playing afternoons, and her tea-leaf reading and her herbal powders. She was quaint, Dolly decided, and Amber wasn't bad either. Amber was almost as good as having a sister, even a twin, since their birthdays were on the same day. Not that they looked in the least bit alike. They had both rounded out by now, having bumps that weren't there before, and starting their monthlies, which Granny Penn had managed to explain without too much throat-clearing. Dolly was still small and dainty with that china doll prettiness that her classmates alternately envied and resented, while Amber was taller, darker, with more dramatic looks that had already made her a beautiful young girl who looked older than her years. Together they made a striking pair. The nickname Amber had given Dolly when she first arrived at the cottage wasn't so far wrong. Dolly sometimes daydreamed too about what would happen when the war was over, and it had nothing to do with her mother. She wanted to go home, of course she did, but there was a small part of her that wouldn't mind staying in Cornwall forever, providing she had someone special of her own. Granny Penn was always strictly fair to them both, but she was still Amber's gran. Dolly didn't truly belong properly to anyone here, and the many talks she and Amber often had now about married people and what they did had given her peculiar feelings in her tummy that weren't altogether unpleasant. She didn't fully understand them, but when she drifted into one of her dreams about having a special person of her own, the hazy face she dreamed about was that of a handsome boy with dark curly hair and laughing eyes. Sometimes, when Amber was asleep in her own bed, Dolly would retrieve the crumpled photo of a small boy that she had sneaked out of Luke Gillam's house. A photo of a small boy with dark hair and laughing eyes who was growing into a man now. School leaving age was 14, so the girls both thought themselves officially grown up when they were due to leave that summer. Neither of them had any clear idea of what they wanted to do. Amber's ambitions changed like the wind. Her vague idea of being a nurse had faded long ago, and eventually Granny Penn suggested she might think about applying to help at the Forces Club near the docks. Dolly had decided that any shop that would employ her would be good enough, as long as she was earning a few bob. But the minute she heard about the opportunity at the Forces Club, she changed her mind. Helping to cheer up the many servicemen in the town who frequented it appealed to Dolly.
conversely, Amber immediately decided against it. They had no choice over sharing their lives, but once school days were over, Amber didn't want to be thought of as one half of a pair who couldn't bear to be separated. Besides, having become well aware of Dolly's flirtatious nature, Amber wasn't sure she could stand to watch the silly little twerp making eyes at chaps old enough to be her father. She didn't particularly want to be handing out cups of tea and biscuits and washing up after them either. She could do all that at home. But with so many young men away at the war, even married women were taking over many of the jobs that had been thought exclusively theirs. Women became bus conductresses and worked in munitions factories and drove army vehicles, and jobs for girls straight out of school were not quite so plentiful now. Dolly had already begun work at the Forces Club when one of Granny Penn's cronies at her Knitting Socks for Soldiers meeting came up with a suggestion for Amber. Mrs. Veal owned a little craft shop off one of the cobbled alleyways leading down to the quays. It was a moderately successful business, of a special interest to visiting seamen looking for souvenirs for their wives or sweethearts. They were always fascinated by the unique Cornishness of the wares, whether it was a corn dolly, a crochet mat in a particular Cornish design, a teapot stand, or a piece of jewellery crafted out of Cornish stone or pebbles that Mr. Veal fashioned in the back room. He could also turn a piece of driftwood into polished shapes that resembled animals or fish, and what he called wooden love spoons in Celtic designs, and the shop window was crammed full of such items to intrigue visitors to the county. "Go down there and see what you think, Amber," said Granny Penn. "You can't waste your time waiting for something wonderful to turn up, because it never does. You can't depend on luck either. You've got to go out and make your luck in this world." It was ironic and a bit galling that the very thing Dolly had first wanted to do, work in a shop, was the one opening put in Amber's way now. But because she knew Granny Penn was right, and she didn't want Dolly crowing over her about the wage packet she got at the end of every week now, she reported to Veal's craft shop. The minute she stepped inside it, she felt as if she was in Wonderland. There was nothing humdrum about this shop. It was full of magic and mystery, and she knew exactly why Granny Penn thought so highly of it. There were packets with strange names on them that sounded and smelled mystically Eastern. Granny Penn probably got half the ingredients for her herbal powders here. There were pendant necklaces with polished stones, and Amber immediately noticed one in particular, a gleaming gold-coloured pendant stone that felt smooth and sensually warm to the touch, and whose colour seemed to go deep inside it forever. "I thought that'd take your eye, Amber, love," Mrs. Veal said complacently, when the girl had poked around the shelves and displays with a feeling that she wanted to buy every single thing on offer. "Why? Is it some magic charm?" she said with a grin, thinking Mrs. Veal was halfway to being as dotty and mysterious as half the town thought her grandmother. "It's Amber, your stone. Not your birthstone, your name stone, although Amber is also associated with Aquarius, which is your birth sign," Mrs. Veal said. "In fact, there are many tales about the magical properties of Amber, so don't scoff." "I'm not scoffing," Amber said, thinking this was turning into the most intriguing conversation she'd had in ages. She fingered the shimmering stone curiously. "So what's it supposed to do, then?" "Well, amber pendants, like this one, were once worn to preserve chastity. And that's always a good thing. Amber is also a talisman for good luck and a guard against evil. In fact, many years ago, sailors used to burn amber on ships to drive away sea serpents and other perils of the deep." "Good Lord," Amber said, near mesmerised by all that the woman was saying, and the almost dreamy way she was saying it. She gave a shaky laugh. "Perhaps the government ought to issue a piece of amber to every sailor who goes to sea during the war, then.
And the soldiers and airmen too, to keep them safe.
She gave a sudden gulp, as if she had never really sensed the immense danger all of them were in before now. Or else, she hadn't wanted to see it. Even Tomo's son being killed had been remote from her. Sad though it was, it had nothing to do with her. She was 14 years old, just leaving school behind her, and the war didn't really touch her, and she didn't want it to. As if it was red hot, she put the amber pendant back on the shelf, and her voice cracked when she spoke.
Well, I think it's all a lot of nonsense, although I know you and Granny Penn see all kinds of omens and signs in perfectly ordinary things. Ah, but that's just the point, my dear. Nothing in this world is perfectly ordinary, is it? Now then, come and have a glass of lemonade and tell me if you're going to come and work for me or not. If you do, I'm sure we can come to some arrangement about letting you have the pendant at a reasonable price. I don't want to buy it, Amber spluttered. But even as she spoke, she knew she wanted it desperately. Its glowing surface was as bright as the sun, as fathomless as the sea, and she had never wanted anything so much. We'll see, Mrs. Veal said. Anyway, I'll put it aside for you until you've made up your mind. It's the only one of its kind we have at present.
Amber watched as the woman removed the pendant again. There was a faint film of dust on the shelf where it had lain. Without thinking, Amber wiped it away with her finger. As she did so, a shadow outside the window caught her eye, and then the shadow became a person with a face, and it was Luke. She hadn't seen him for some weeks now, and in that time he seemed to have got taller and broader and more serious looking. Or perhaps the look was because he was surprised at seeing her inside Veal's craft shop, apparently dusting shelves. And then the look changed to a smile, and seconds later the bell above the door tinkled and he came inside. "Don't tell me you're a working girl at last," he greeted her. "Though I don't know why I should be surprised to see you in here. It's the obvious place for you." She found her breath without realizing she had been holding it for those brief seconds.
Why should it be?
Luke laughed. "Well, I never expected you to be doing some ordinary job. It always had to be somewhere among the weird and wonderful, didn't it?" Amber wanted to rage at him the way she always did when he baited her. But even more she wanted him to finish the sentence by adding a few more words. "Just like you, weird and wonderful. Just like you." He never said it, of course. And then Mrs. Veal appeared from behind the bead curtain at the back of the shop again, and told Luke he was welcome to join them for some lemonade on this hot day. "Thanks all the same, and I wish I could, but me and Dad have got a big job on, and I'm just in town to get some supplies," he said regretfully. "We're doing war work at the yard now, but it's a bit hush-hush, so don't ask me about it." "I wasn't going to," Mrs. Veal said with a smile. "So, was there anything in here that you wanted, Luke?"
Only me, thought Amber. Say it's only me.
"No, I was just passing and saw Amber in here. I'm glad you've got her working at last, Mrs. Veal. And how about the other one? Is Dolly lurking somewhere behind the scenes as well?" "No, she's not," Amber snapped. "And if you've got errands to do for your dad, hadn't you better get on and do them?" She turned around and flounced away from him, hearing him mutter something like, "Still the same old temper, then," before she heard the doorbell tinkle again, and he was gone. "It doesn't always do to wear your heart on your sleeve, Amber, love," Mrs. Veal said, as Amber followed her through the bead curtain to the rear of the shop. "When you're a bit older, you'll find that being a bit more subtle is far more likely to get results." "I don't know what you mean," Amber said. But she did. And right there and then she really wished she was older. Wished it hard, even though her gran always said it was wicked to wish time away, and you should cherish what you had. But if only she was older, maybe Luke Gillam would stop thinking of her as a child and think of her as a woman, or a sweetheart, or a lover. The word slid into her mind, delicious and wicked. And she felt her face grow hot as Mrs. Veal put the cool drink of lemonade in front of her, because despite all her schoolgirl dreaming about him, she had never actually thought of Luke in quite that way before. But she was thinking of it now. Side 4. Dolly sat on her bed with a superior smile, her legs crossed beneath her as she watched Amber put the torturous pipe cleaners in her hair to try and curl it.
I'm glad I don't need to do all that,
she said.
So you've told me 100 times, Amber retorted.
It's not even as if it does any good. You end up with a few springy curls for half an hour, and then it springs back out again, and it's as straight as a ruler. Why go through the pain of sleeping on all those bumps for nothing?
Amber glared at her.
I'm training it. The more I do it, the more it'll get used to being curly instead of straight. She was never going to admit how much she envied Dolly's natural golden curls, and nor was she going to let on that one night she tried fixing the curls with sugar water and had to spend time the following morning washing it all out before she could get the pipe cleaners out of the sticky mess. It was all the rage at the flicks now for girls to have waves and curls, and Amber wanted to be one of them. The customers who came into Veal's craft shop deserved to see somebody glamorous working in such a glamorous place, however small it was, but she just wasn't glamorous. She easily overlooked her own dramatic dark looks when she thought about the film stars at the flicks, all of them blonde, like Dolly.
What are you staring at now?
Dolly scowled, unravelling her legs and going over to the small mirror to get a look in and fluff up her own hair before bedtime.
Nothing,
Amber began, and then there was a howl from Dolly as she almost pushed Amber out of the way.
Here, what did you do that for? I've got a huge spot,
Dolly yelled.
Right there, by the side of my nose. I look hideous, and everybody will laugh at me if it hasn't gone by next month.
It'll be long gone by then. What's happening next month, anyway? Amber asked suspiciously.
Didn't I tell you?
Dolly said studiously, inspecting the small red spot and avoiding Amber's eyes.
It's going to be a dance at the Forces Club to raise funds for the Dunkirk victims. I'll be serving teas and drinks in the interval.
No, you didn't tell me. And has Granny Penn agreed to this?
Well, it's my work, isn't it?
Dolly said, her big blue eyes innocent.
You could have been going if you hadn't wanted to work in a soppy craft shop.
It's not soppy. And you're right. That spot on your nose is hideous. She was being petty and she knew it, but inside she was raging. Dolly knew very well she hadn't mentioned any dance in October. Neither of them was allowed out late in the evenings, unless it was for some special reason. She was surprised Granny Penn thought a dance was a special reason for somebody of Dolly's age. But of course, she was going to serve teas and drinks in the interval, and she'd be well chaperoned by the older women who worked there. As if that would stop Dolly flirting with any good-looking chap who caught her eye.
I'm going downstairs to get a drink of water,
Amber said, and whirled out of the room with one side of her hair still long and straight, and the other side pipe-curled up against her head
like a porcupine. She found her gran reading the newspaper in the parlour and having a late-night cup of cocoa.
Dolly says she's going to help out at the Forces Club dance next month. Can I see if I can go and help too? She said.
Granny Penn frowned at being suddenly interrupted, just as she was reading about the latest German bombing raids on the coastal towns and the reprisal raids by the RAF, and wondering just how much the government was suppressing about how bad the situation really was. Dunkirk had been both a triumph and a disaster, but nothing could take away the fact that the English coast was more accessible to the enemy now, and that invasion was no longer a distant nightmare, but a real possibility. For a moment, she couldn't get her mind off the war and the futility of it all, just like the last one. And then she fully registered the girl standing in front of her in that bizarre manner, arms crossed tightly over her nightgown, her eyes blazing.
"Good heavens, Amber, what are you doing down here like this? Do you know what time it is? And what a sketch you look!"
At the sharp sound of her voice, Amber couldn't speak for a moment. Her eyes filled with tears at the injustice of it all, when all she wanted was to look beautiful and glamorous and to be allowed to do what Dolly was doing.
You're letting her go, so why can't I? You always favour her, just because she's a poor little evacuee, she mimicked. But I'm your granddaughter, not her.
She was shivering, not so much with cold, even though the fire had dwindled to nothing in the grate now, despite being banked up with old newspapers, soaked in tea leaves and then dried and made into briquettes, in the way the government was urging people to do to save coal. She shivered at knowing it was always going to be the same between her and Dolly, and she hadn't wanted to blurt it all out like that. But Dolly's announcement about the dance was just about the last straw.
"Come and sit down, Amber," Granny Penn said gently. "Of course it's not true that I always favour Dolly over you, and for goodness sake, let me take those ridiculous pipe cleaners out of your hair."
"I've only just put them in,"
Amber said, jerking away as Granny Penn began to tug at one of the pipe cleaners.
"Well, you look much prettier with your hair straight as nature intended. You shouldn't try to copy someone else, my dear. You should be proud to be yourself. Your mother had hair just like yours, and she never felt the need to try and tame it," she added with a sigh.
"Did she?"
Amber said, her thoughts temporarily frozen. It was rare that Granny Penn spoke about either of Amber's parents.
"Oh, yes. It was just as long and black and shiny, and your father spent hours brushing it for her when they were first married. It was lovely to watch them together. But I don't suppose you can do that with tight curly hair."
She continued unwinding the pipe cleaners, speaking quietly but unemotionally, and it was Amber whose throat felt choked, imagining the intimate act between the mother she never knew and the father she couldn't remember. There was only a hazy photograph of them that Granny Penn kept in a frame in her bedroom, and a few that she kept in a cardboard box she called her memory box.
"You're so much like her, Amber. The older you get, the more I see her in you. Don't ever lose that, my dear."
Amber yanked out the remaining pipe cleaner and gave a sigh of relief. She truly hated sleeping on the horrid things, and she had only been doing it for a couple of months since she started work. The idea had been to make her look older and more sophisticated, but she knew it hadn't worked. Besides, it took her ages to get comfortable in bed, and there and then she decided not to bother any more.
"So, can I go to the Forces Club dance if they'll let me help?"
she repeated, remembering what she had come downstairs for. 5 minutes later she crept back up to her bedroom with a triumphant smile on her face. Dolly had blown out the candle now and pulled back the curtains a little, but there was enough light in the room for Amber to get into bed. So, who wanted prissy Shirley Temple curls anyway? Dolly was already asleep, one arm flung outside her bed. Amber saw that she had dropped something on the floor, and she bent to pick it up. For a moment she stared at it, trying to think who the small boy was in the crumpled photo. She tiptoed across to the window to get a better look, and then she gave a furious gasp as she recognised it. The little sneak had pinched this from Luke Gillam's house when his mum had shown them the photos. Dolly had pinched it and kept it all this time, as if he was her boy. Well, she wasn't keeping it any longer. Shaking with rage now, Amber got into bed with the precious photo beneath her pillow and fell asleep while she was still deciding what she was going to do about it. But one thing was sure. This was war, just as surely as that other one. It was a certainty that Dolly wasn't going to ask about the photo, and just as certain that Amber wasn't going to tell her she had found it. Let Dolly sweat a bit, wondering if Granny Penn had picked it up when she was cleaning their bedroom. Granny Penn might not recognise who it was in the photo, although Luke hadn't really changed that much. But she wouldn't be too pleased to know Dolly was thinking about boys either. Granny Penn hadn't been the one to find it. But Dolly didn't know that, and Amber enjoyed watching the little sneak eyeing Granny Penn cautiously, as if wondering when the axe was going to fall, and doing extra little jobs to please her. She ached to keep the photo herself, but instead she knew it gave her the perfect excuse to go to the boatyard and call on Luke's mother to return the photo, saying it must have accidentally fallen into one of their satchels. She wasn't going to say it was Dolly's, but the fact that Amber was honest enough to return it probably spoke for itself. Dolly wasn't the only one who could be sneaky. During the time she had been working at the craft shop, Amber had become familiar with many of the objects crammed into every space. She loved being surrounded by them, and often found herself weaving stories about them, especially the exotic eastern smells from the packets of spices and dried herbs. It wasn't a busy shop like a dairy or bakery, and since there were plenty of quiet moments, she had watched, fascinated, as Mr. Veal fashioned a wooden love spoon from a piece of driftwood. She'd even tried her hand at making some crochet doilies to Mrs. Veal's own design, and was pathetically pleased with the result. But now, at the end of Friday afternoon when the shop closed, she had a mission of her own to attend to. She rode her bike through the bustling streets of the town, where there were plenty of uniforms to be seen now, from regular servicemen to ARP wardens to civil defence people, home guard and ambulance drivers. Seeing some of the old boys in the town puffed up with importance in their new roles, Amber thought it must feel good to wear a uniform, but the only one she had ever worn was a brownie uniform, long discarded. If the war went on for years and years, though, she supposed the time would still come when she, and Dolly too, could be called up, and then they'd have to wear them, unless they went into horrible munitions factories. It was a thought that made her wobble on her bike and almost come off as she neared Gillam's boatyard. "You better mind where you're going, or you'll find yourself carted off in one of those things yourself," she heard a voice say as an ambulance trundled by, and she looked straight up into the eyes of Luke Gillam, just walking into the boatyard ahead of her as the daylight began to fade. Instead of being thrilled to be in such unexpected closeness with her hero, she was frantically embarrassed. This had seemed like such a good idea, bringing back the photo and letting Mrs. Gillam know in a subtle way who had taken it. Now, as she got off her bike and walked along beside Luke, with her heart thumping, she felt stupid, wondering how she was going to explain herself when the inevitable question came. "So, what are you doing here, kiddo? Mrs. Veal was asking around for any old scraps of wool for picture making, I think, but I don't know whether Mum has sorted out anything yet." Her heart suddenly skipped a beat. He didn't think he'd said anything out of the ordinary, but Amber's spectacular smile lit up her face as if he had. She could almost ignore the fact that he'd called her kiddo, as if she was still a child, when all her feelings towards him were definitely grown-up ones, even if he didn't know it. He'd given her the perfect reason for being here. "Well, of course it's your mum I've come to see. You didn't think I'd come all this way to see you, did you?" she said airily. "No," he grinned. "You're far too busy being a shop girl now." "A craft shop
assistant, if you don't mind. There's far more to it than just serving customers with their weekly newspaper or something. Ours is a creative business," she added grandly. He laughed out loud. "My God, Amber, you do like to put on airs and graces, don't you? And since when did it become our business? Are you planning to take it over?" "I might, one day. I rather fancy having my own business." She'd never thought of it before, and she wasn't thinking of it now. She was still hardly out of school. But if it ever happened, it would make her a somebody in this town, and far more important than a minor somebody who was content to serve tea and sandwiches in a Forces Club canteen. And listening to her own thoughts, fancying herself, she knew she could turn into a right little snob with no bother. "You need to be better at sums than you ever were at school, then," she heard Luke say with a laugh. "You hardly knew what 2 and 2 made sometimes, if I remember correctly." "As long as I know what 1 and 1 makes, that's good enough for me," Amber whipped out, and then blushed as he gave her shoulders a quick hug. "You kill me sometimes. You really do," he said. And then he went off, whistling, never realizing how her words had been aimed specifically at him. She gazed after him as he disappeared into one of the huge sheds from where she could hear the sound of hammering and machinery, wondering if he had any idea at all that the only one she was thinking about was Luke and Amber. Amber and Luke. She turned away quickly and walked up to the front door of the Gillam house, adjacent to the boatyard. "Amber! How nice to see you, dear," Mrs. Gillam said, slightly puzzled as to why the girls should be visiting her at all. She was growing up, Mrs. Gillam reflected. She was nearly as tall as Luke now, and that glorious black hair and those deep blue eyes were going to charm some young man's heart one of these days in the not-too-distant future. "I came to bring you something," Amber said, a little awkwardly. "I think it belongs to you. In fact, I know it does." "You better come inside, then, and have some supper. The men will be in soon, and you're welcome to join us if your gran won't worry about you going home after dark." "Oh, I didn't mean to stay," Amber said, flustered. "I only came on an errand, of sorts." "Well, an errand still deserves a cup of tea and a piece of cake at least. So stop dithering, there's a love, and tell me what it is that's so important." Amber followed Luke's mother inside, not knowing quite how to begin. And then it all came out in a rush. "When we were here before, me and Dolly, and you were showing us photos, I think this one somehow fell into somebody's satchel. We don't use them anymore, of course, now that we've left school, but we were emptying them the other day to pass them on to the other children, and, well, here it is," she finished lamely, and handed it over. Mrs. Gillam took the photo from Amber and gave a slight smile as she thanked her for it. "It's kind of you to return it, but there was no need. I've got plenty of others. And you can keep it if you like, Amber." She handed it back, but Amber flinched away from it, as if it was poisonous. "Oh, no, I don't want it. It wasn't me. I mean, well, it doesn't belong to me, does it? Gran always says it's important to keep photos because they're part of somebody's life and shouldn't be given away, or you might be giving away a little part of them as well." God, where the dickens did all that come from? Amber must have heard it from somewhere, and it was almost certainly Granny Penn who had said it, but she didn't truly remember hearing it. The words just seemed to appear in her mind. Luke's mother smiled again, but this time the smile was a little strained. "I'm sure Granny Penn has all sorts of philosophies to pass on to you, Amber, but in the middle of a war I'm not sure anybody wants to hear of taking away a little part of somebody's life." "Oh, she didn't mean it like that. Neither did I. I don't really know what I meant," she said, in real distress now. "I know you didn't. So let's not talk any more about it. I'll put this old photo back where it belongs, and then you can help me set the table for when the men come in." "I don't think I can stay, thank you all the same. I forgot I have to be home on time tonight because Gran's going out," she stammered. It was already growing dark,
and there would be no lights for her to make her way home through the town and to the outskirts where they lived. She knew the roads like the back of her hand, but there had been more than one account of people crashing into lamp-posts and stationary vehicles in the blackout, and the whole town had been shocked to hear about an ARP man on night duty who had suffered a serious head injury from just such a blow, which had killed him. Amber made her escape, knowing it was more than she could bear to be sitting around a table with Luke and his parents, remembering she'd said something far too emotive and simply appalling about taking away part of a person's life by something as silly as the gift of a photograph. It was completely thoughtless when people were being bombed and losing their lives in air raids. Thankfully, Luke's father was too old to go to war, and Luke was too young. But all the same, she should never have said it, and she just couldn't stay. She cycled home as the clouds darkened overhead, and a fine warm rain began to fall, cooling her fiery cheeks as she wondered how she could have been so insensitive, and knowing to her shame that it was still the child in her, blurting everything out without thinking when she was trying so hard to behave like an adult. She finally arrived home and had to submit to her grand's fussing as she rubbed her hair dry in the parlour and took off her damp jacket and shoes. At last she was allowed to go upstairs to her bedroom and change her clothes and find her slippers. Dolly had already lit their candle and pulled the blackout curtains across the window, and she was now preening this way and that in front of the mirror as she experimented with one of Amber's hair ribbons. It was the final straw.
"Do you always steal things that don't belong to you?"
Amber yelled, almost flying across the room to snatch the ribbon back and fling it onto her bed.
"I wasn't stealing it. I was only seeing how it looked on my hair. The colour looks better on me anyway,"
Dolly said rudely.
"Well, it's mine, and it's still stealing when you take something that doesn't belong to you. Or didn't they teach you that in your London school?"
She stared at Dolly unflinchingly, her eyes large and accusing, and Dolly's face went a dull red. The photo of Luke wasn't mentioned, but Amber was pretty sure Dolly knew exactly what she was talking about. She suddenly foraged in one of her allotted drawers and dragged out a pen and a second ribbon and threw them at Amber.
"You better have these then. I was only borrowing them, and if you don't know the difference, you don't know much, do you, clever clogs?"
It was tempting to hurl the accusation back at Dolly, but right on cue as the night darkened, they heard the moan of an air raid siren, and Granny Penn was shouting at them to come downstairs at once. Dolly's face seemed to change from red to white in an instant, and Amber realised how petrified she really was about being bombed after the graphic details her mother chose to send her. "Oh, come on," Amber said roughly. "It's not worth bothering about, providing you promise not to do it again."
"Well, I'll try not to,"
Dolly began, and then felt a yank on her arm as Amber pulled her to the door.
"All right, I bleeding well promise."
Amber wasn't sure that Dolly was too concerned about keeping promises, but none of it mattered as much as doing what they had been told to do in an air raid.
"Where is he?"
Dolly whispered, as Granny Penn bundled them into the cupboard under the stairs, as if the Jerrys were going to rain bombs down on them at any minute, when all they could hear was distant gunfire.
"Where's what?" "You know what."
"I don't know what you're talking about," Amber said, and then she yelped as she felt a vicious pinch on her arm. "If you mean something that didn't belong to you in the first place, it's gone back where it belongs." Dolly didn't answer, and Amber felt ridiculously pleased at keeping the little twerp guessing without actually saying anything. Then came a sudden louder burst of gunfire and the drone of aircraft overhead, and Dolly screamed and clung to Amber, whose mood changed at once. "It's all right, you're safe with us," she said clumsily. "The stupid Jerrys might be aiming for the docks, but they'll probably go for the decoy place, and they're not going to bother about one little cottage out in the sticks, are they?"
"You don't know that," Dolly whimpered. "My mum says they drop their bombs anywhere they like. They don't care how many people they kill." Well, I don't suppose our chaps always hit their targets either, so it's tit for tat, isn't there? Not that she liked to think of the RAF chaps killing people just for the sake of it, but war was war, and they all had to do as they were told. I wonder what's worse, being drowned at sea or being blown up on the ground, or being blasted out of the sky by an enemy bomber, she said conversationally, more to keep Dolly from shaking than anything else, but it was hardly the best topic to choose. As Dolly gave a little scream and told her she was horrible, Granny Penn spoke sharply from the other side of the cupboard. If you two don't keep quiet, we'll never hear the all clear, and it sounds as if the worst is past already. The girls perked up, listening hard, and realizing that the drone of aircraft had already stopped, and there was no more gunfire. Either the planes had given up, or it had been another hit-and-run raid, which was happening all too frequently when, according to Granny Penn, the Jerrys didn't really know which target to hit, and aimed for anything that looked like a large town. That was her theory, anyway. Sure enough, not long afterwards the all clear sounded, and when the girls emerged from the cupboard, Granny Penn was putting their supper on the table and telling them to clear it up themselves as she searched for her torch, grumbling that she was already late for her evening meeting. You're not going now after that raid, are you?
Dolly squeaked.
Of course I am. It'll be a long time before a Cornish woman lets a few Jerry planes prevent her from going about her normal business. They were early tonight, but they won't be back now they've done their stuff. You two girls can amuse yourselves without any worries, and I'll be back later. She was a stoic, Amber thought, with a surge of affection. She was made of strong stuff, as tough as Cornish granite. She had seen her son die and her daughter-in-law die in childbirth, and she had never wavered in bringing up Amber as her own, nor at bringing Dolly into her home. Good old Gran, she said softly, at which Granny Penn grimaced. Not so much of the old young lady, she said, ramming her hat on top of her grey curls. We all do what we have to do these days, and it wouldn't hurt you two to do something for the war effort either. You can both knit, and there's wool and patterns in the sideboard drawer. There's many a soldier who'd be glad of an extra pair of socks. If you can't do that, then get on with unravelling that old grey cardigan of mine. I can wash the wool and use it again. No, I must get on. There was a small silence after she had gone, as the girls ate their supper of spam and bread, spread so thinly with butter they could hardly see it. She's quite a girl, ain't she? Dolly said at last. Do you think we give her a hard time? Probably, Amber said. She don't deserve it though, does she? Dolly persisted. I mean, she didn't have to take me in, and you didn't have to share your bedroom with me, did you? Amber stared suspiciously. What's this? Your conscience talking? Dolly flushed. Perhaps it is. I know I ain't always the easiest person to get on with, and I pinch things without meaning to. Well, not always without meaning to, but you always seem to have everything. I'm not exactly rich, am I? Amber said. No, but you've got a gran who'd do anything for you, and my mum, well, I reckon she was glad to get rid of me when the war started. It wasn't just for my sake that she put me on that train at Paddington. She couldn't hide the bitterness in her voice, and it wasn't hard for Amber to follow her thoughts. Her dad away in the army, and all those uncles who came to the house, and now this Uncle Joe who was taking care of her mum. No wonder Dolly could be a nuisance. She looked so abject now that Amber couldn't help feeling sorry for her. You can have a bit of my spam if you like, she offered. After a startled second, Dolly grinned. I'll swap you for half a piece of bread and scrape, she said. It was hardly the beginning of a beautiful friendship, but it was a start. The Forces Club dance to raise funds in aid of the Dunkirk victims was open to all.
"The more the merrier for our brave servicemen," said the slogan outside the place, inviting everyone to come and donate whatever they could spare to the collecting buckets inside. Granny Penn said she might even come herself, which met with a united howl of disapproval from Amber and Dolly. "Well, at least there's something you two seem to agree about," she said mildly, "and thank heaven it's been a bit more harmonious around here lately."
"We decided to be more like sisters," Amber said importantly. "Sisters that sometimes fight," Dolly added. "But on the whole, Amber ain't too bad, and I could have done a lot worse."
"So could I. And a lot better."
But a minor miracle had occurred since the night when Dolly had revealed how hurt she had felt over her mum abandoning her to the back of beyond in Cornwall, as she put it. They had since forgotten much of their antagonism towards one another, and found it was far easier to confide in each other than to fight. There was one thing that Amber had no intention of confiding in Dolly about, though, and that was the way she felt about Luke Gillam. They might be sisters of a sort now, but sisters could still be rivals in love, and Dolly had a fine knack of wanting what somebody else had. It probably came from her not having had much of a life in the first place, Amber conceded, but there was no way she was going to share Luke's affection with her, even if she had it.
"Don't worry," Granny Penn went on. "I'll give you a donation for the cause, but my dancing days are over. In any case, I don't know how anybody can dance to this fast and noisy music that's on the wireless so often now."
"It's called jazz music, Gran, as you very well know, and you can't really dance to it, so you just have to jig about on your own," Amber said, her eyes sparkling as she imagined Granny Penn kicking her legs about with the best of them.
Granny Penn sniffed. "They had proper dancing in my day. Waltzes and foxtrots, and gentlemen were courteous to their partners and held them discreetly, and didn't just prance about by themselves."
With her inside knowledge of the event, Dolly informed her of what was going to happen.
"There's still going to be plenty of waltzes and foxtrots, Granny Penn, and velitas, and military two-steps for old folks as well."
"Cheeky young madam," Granny Penn said. "I suppose you'd put me in that category, would you?"
"I wouldn't dare," she giggled.
It didn't seem such an imposition for Dolly to joke with her gran any more, Amber thought. She was glad they got along so well, and it was more fun for the two of them to gang up on Granny Penn and tease her when they got the chance than always to be at loggerheads. It was good to have a sister, even a make-believe one. They were excited about the dance. It would be the first grown-up dance they had been to. They both had their orders to serve the teas and sandwiches during the interval, but after that they would be free to join the rest of the dancers. They might even jig about to the jazz tunes themselves, though there would only be a few of those, despite what they had told Granny Penn. Most of the dances would be the kind that Granny Penn considered respectable.
"My supervisor says they might make some of the old-time dances progressive,"
Dolly said as they got ready to go out that evening. They were each wearing a dress that Granny Penn had made for them, using up some of her own precious clothing coupons to buy the material. Amber's was sky blue, and Dolly's was apple green. They each admired the other one, and then set about applying a touch of lipstick and rouged their cheeks as much as they dared.
"What's progressive?"
Amber said, wondering if Luke would be there tonight. His parents would probably come too. It wasn't a dance solely for young people. They weren't the ones with the money for the donations, and the whole idea was to raise funds. Dolly was a bit vague about what progressive dancing meant too, having only just heard about it herself.
"I think it's when all the couples dance in a circle, and then the compere tells one partner to move ahead at a certain part of the dance, so that you all get a new partner."
"It sounds smashing," Amber said excitedly. "I hope we're doing it when it's progressive then." Dolly glanced at her, and, as if for the first time, She saw how truly beautiful Amber was, with her eyes and her lips glowing. Beside her, she felt suddenly pale and dowdy, despite the new apple-green dress.
"Well, you'll have to wait until somebody asks you to dance first, dummy," she said sharply. "I'd probably die if a boy asked me to dance, with all those old people looking at us. But we can always dance together."
Dolly shrugged.
"I suppose so."
This idea didn't exactly appeal to Dolly. She wanted to be swept off her feet by some handsome young man, preferably in uniform, who wanted to dance with her the whole evening. But she knew how unlikely that was. Ladies did dance together, and often had to when there was a shortage of males. But if the dance was progressive, then hopefully one of them should end up with a male partner at some stage of the evening. That night, everyone seemed determined to forget there was a war on when they entered the newly decorated Forces Club, with balloons and banners and flags everywhere. The local band was already playing a background tune, so, providing old Jerry stayed away tonight, everyone was set on having a good time. The Penry girls had to cover their new dresses with work overalls for the first part of the evening. But then each of them was going to emerge like a butterfly from a chrysalis, Amber told Dolly poetically, which made her screech with laughter.
"You are a twerp sometimes, Amber. I ain't no bleeding butterfly, and I ain't one of them whatever it was you said neither." "It's a chrysalis. Didn't you pay attention to anything at school?"
Dolly wasn't paying attention now. She was more interested in a group of newcomers who had just entered the Forces Club. Among them were the old gang of friends who had all left school now, most of whom they hadn't seen for a while. They all looked so grown up, dressed up to the nines for the occasion. Among them was Luke Gillam.
"Look who's just arrived,"
Dolly said, then half wished she hadn't drawn Amber's attention to him. He didn't scrub up at all badly, as her mum would have said, and he got taller and broader in these past few months. "Who?" Amber said absently, as if she hadn't known the minute he arrived, and stood up a bit taller and straighter behind the canteen counter because of it. The normal tables and chairs had been pushed to the sides of the room, making a large open space for dancing, and the large open space was rapidly filling with people.
"You bleedin' well know who," Dolly said with a grin. "You're bloke."
Among the people arriving now were Mr. and Mrs. Veal, and Amber felt obliged to wave back to them as Dolly sniggered.
"I bet old Veal will want to dance with you. I heard him telling you he used to like to trip the light fantastic, whatever the hell that means."
"It just means dancing, you dope. I hope he doesn't ask me. He sweats a lot." They both started giggling and were told to get on with preparing the spam and scrape sandwiches that would be on offer later, all proceeds for the cause. Amber hoped Luke would ask her to dance, but she didn't think it was likely. Her main hope was if he and the other younger ones got up to do one of the progressive old-time dances, goaded into it by the compere. Although the older people in the canteen were greeting friends and neighbours and chatting together, it seemed as if all the girls her age were huddled together on one side of the room and all the boys on the other. A fat chance you had of getting to know a chap if he couldn't even be bothered to sit near you or talk to you, Amber thought indignantly.